Imagine finding the love of your life only to watch them disappear into the shadows of war. Now imagine that same love resurfacing 50 years later, through words written half a century ago, preserved in an envelope yellowed by time. This is the story of Carlos Almeida and Maria Helena, a story that makes us question whether destiny truly exists. My love, if this letter reaches your hands, know that there is no ocean, war, or time that can erase what I feel. These were the last words Carlos wrote to Maria Helena in 1961, before departing for Angola. Words she never read. Until 2011. Lisbon, 1960. The streets of Alfama echoed with fado music as young Carlos Almeida, then 22 years old, walked to his job at his father's small printing shop. Born into a modest family, Carlos dreamed of becoming a writer, saving every penny he earned to one day publish his poems. It was on an autumn afternoon when Carlos saw Maria Helena for the first time. She was buying bread at the bakery across from the print shop. Their eyes met through the dusty window, and Carlos felt something he had never experienced before. It was as if time stood still, he would recount years later. Maria Helena Oliveira, 19 years old, a nursing student, daughter of a respected Lisbon doctor. Two different worlds that crossed paths by chance? Or was it destiny? Their meetings began in secret. Maria Helena's father would never accept his daughter being involved with a simple printer. "He has plans for me. He wants me to marry the son of his doctor colleague," Maria confided to Carlos during one of their secret meetings in Estrella Garden. For 6 months, they lived in intense and forbidden love. Carlos wrote poems on small pieces of paper that he folded into the shape of birds. Maria kept each one in a wooden box under her bed. "When I'm with you, I feel like I could face the entire world," Carlos told Maria on their last night together, before fate and Portuguese history intervened in their lives. In January 1961, the beginning of the Portuguese colonial war in Angola changed everything. Carlos, like many young Portuguese men, received his draft notice for military service. Devastating news that arrived just as he was planning to run away with Maria to the north of the country. "I'll come back to you no matter how long it takes," Carlos promised at the train station while holding Maria's trembling hands. "Wait for me." What Carlos didn't know was that Maria Helena's father had discovered their romance. Furious, he took advantage of the young man's departure to finalize his plans. Less than a month after Carlos left, he announced his daughter's engagement to Mirals, the son of his colleague and a newly graduated doctor who, due to health problems, was exempt from military service. In the suffocating heat of Angola, between military operations and sleepless nights, Carlos wrote. Letter after letter, he poured his soul onto paper, telling about the horrors of war, his fears, but mostly reaffirming his love and his plans for when he returned. "We'll build a life together, Maria. A small house with a garden where our children can play. I endure all this by thinking of that future." What Carlos didn't know was that his letters never reached their destination. Maria's father intercepted each one, hiding them in the lining of an old chest in his office. For Maria, Carlos's silence was confirmation that he had forgotten her, or worse, that perhaps he was no longer alive. Pressured by her family and believing she had been abandoned, Maria finally gave in. In a joyless ceremony, she married in December 1961, less than a year after Carlos's departure. Angola, 1963. Carlos finally returned to Lisbon, thin, with visible scars on his body and invisible ones on his soul. His first stop was Maria Helena's house, only to discover that she had married and moved to Porto with her husband. The impact of the news was devastating. I felt as if all the strength that kept me alive during the war had been sucked out of me in that instant. Carlos would recount years later, unable to remain in Lisbon, where every street, every corner reminded him of Maria. Carlos emigrated to Brazil in 1964. In São Paulo, he rebuilt his life as the owner of a small bookstore. He married a Brazilian woman of Portuguese descent, had 2 children, but never managed to completely forget his first love. Meanwhile, in Porto, Maria Helena lived a materially comfortable but emotionally empty life. Her marriage, too, was cordial but passionless. They had a daughter, Ins Maria's only true joy. She became head nurse at São João Hospital, respected by colleagues and patients, hiding from everyone the melancholy that sometimes consumed her. Porto, 2011. Maria Helena, now 70 years old, had been widowed 3 years earlier. Her daughter insisted that her mother leave the empty house and move to a smaller apartment. "There's so much to organize, so many memories," Maria said as she hesitated to begin the difficult task of dismantling a life. It was during the cleaning of the office that had belonged to her father and later to her husband that the past resurfaced. While taking apart an old oak chest, a small package tied with twine fell from the already deteriorated lining. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all with the same handwriting that Maria instantly recognized, even after half a century. With trembling hands, Maria opened the first letter. The date, February 15th. 1961, my beloved Maria. It's been a month since I left Lisbon, and there is on a single day that I do not think of you. ... Quotes, the shock was immense. In each page, she discovered that Carlos had never abandoned her, that every promise made at the train station had been true. And the last letter, dated just days before his return to Lisbon, contained detailed plans to find her. "I need to find him," Maria declared to her daughter Inez, who had never seen such determination in her mother's eyes. "I need him to know that I never received his letters." With the help of the internet, something that still seemed like magic to Maria, Inez began the search. First in Lisbon, then expanding to Brazil. Following clues about a Portuguese man named Carlos Almeida, who owned a bookstore in São Paulo. After weeks of fruitless searches and when hopes were beginning to fade, they found a small online news article about a traditional bookstore in São Paulo. Letters from Lisbon, whose owner, a Portuguese man named Carlos Almeida, had just completed 50 years in Brazil. Maria Helena wrote a letter, the only form that seemed appropriate to re-establish contact. She told about the discovery of the hidden letters, about her life in Porto, about how she had never completely forgotten those 6 months they spent together. "I don't know if you still remember me, or if you still care. I don't know if this letter will disturb your current life, but I could undie knowing that you spent your life believing I had chosen not to wait for you. Some promises, even if not kept, deserve explanations." Carlos, then 73 years old, also widowed for 5 years, received the letter on a rainy August morning. He recognized the handwriting on the envelope before even seeing the sender. His children never understood why their father, always so controlled, cried openly that day in the bookstore. "I'm going to Portugal," Carlos announced to his children that same night. "There's something I need to do." After 50 years in a small cafe in downtown Porto, 2 elderly people looked at each other with eyes that carried decades of life, joys and sorrows, victories and defeats. But, for a few moments, they were once again the young printer and the nursing student who fell in love in Lisbon. "Do you still have the paper birds?" Carlos asked. "All of them," Maria replied, with tears in her eyes. "And now, I also have your letters." At 73, Carlos Almeida and Maria Helena were no longer the young lovers of 1960. They had built families, complete lives, memories created without each other's presence. But they discovered that time, although relentless in many ways, had been kind to the feeling they shared. Carlos sold his bookstore in Brazil and returned permanently to Portugal. Not to rebuild a youthful romance, but to enjoy the company of someone who knew his true self, one with whom he could share memories of a Lisbon that no longer existed. "We're not trying to recover lost time," Maria would later explain to a curious journalist about their story. "We're just grateful that we discovered the truth before it was too late." The story of Carlos and Maria inspired their grandchildren to create a project called Letters of Time, which helps elderly people find lost friends and family members. To date, the project has reconnected over 100 people separated by wars, migrations, or simple misunderstandings. In 2015, Carlos finally published his book of poems, Letters Never Sent, a collection of texts he wrote throughout his life. In the dedication, just one line, "To MH, who proved that some stories deserve a second chapter." Carlos passed away in 2018, holding Maria Helena's hand. Among his belongings, they found a small paper bird, the first one he had given her in 1960, carefully preserved in a glass box. And so ends and begins again the story of Carlos Almeida and Maria Helena. A story that reminds us that true love is not just about finding the right person, but also about the right time. That sometimes destiny, even if delayed, finds a way to correct its own mistakes. As an old Portuguese proverb says, Love is like wine. Some stories only get better with time. What letter would you write to someone you loved in the past? What truths still need to be revealed in your life? Sometimes a simple envelope can change everything, even after 50 years. Share in the comments if this story touched your heart, or if you know similar cases of reunions after decades apart. Remember, it's never too late for a truth to be revealed, for a love to be acknowledged, for a story to be completed.